morning. I'm Ken Bamberger, one of the faculty directors with my colleague Ron Hassner of the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. And we want to welcome you to the Berkeley Institute's session 1 of our summer Salon series. We are very pleased to have with us two incredible scholars today, Professor Itay Fischendler and Dr. Miri-Lavi-Neeman, both of whom are very much part of the Berkeley Institute family. We want to welcome those familiar with the Institute, our partners, our students, and those new to the Institute. And before I say a few words about Professor Fishhendler and Professor Lavi-Neeman, a word about the Institute and a word of housekeeping. The Berkeley Institute houses two core programs: Berkeley's Program on Israel Studies, a nationally recognized initiative for the study of Israel, and Berkeley's Program on Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity, the only program of its type in the Western United States. Our work supports students, faculty, and community engagement around Israel and around Jewish law, thought, and identity. And we host in particular the Undergraduate Fellows Program, which engages students through deep support and mentorship. And we're so happy that so many of our fellows have joined this salon today. And also the Visiting Israeli Professors Program, which brings 5 to 6 Israeli faculty to teach, and then 5 to 6 Israeli researchers and scholars to campus every year as part of our vibrant community. So for the housekeeping, for the duration of the first part of the salon, the talk, all participants will be muted as we hear from Itay and Miri, and that portion will be recorded. Then following the lecture portion of the salon, I'll open the Q&A, and we very much hope to engage in a dialogue. During Q&A, you'll have the chance to electronically raise your hand. You can do that by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen and opting for the hand icon, or you can submit your questions via chat, and I will try to read them and pass them on to our speakers. If you're open to raising your hand electronically, we'd love to hear your voice and bring you into the dialogue. Professor Itay Fischendler heads the Environmental and Planning Program at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and is the chair of Hebrew University's Department of Geography. He focuses on environmental conflict resolution and national resources governance. He's really a global leading scholar working with scholars in Israel and at Berkeley on transboundary water issues and institutions and Middle Eastern water policy, and is now engaged in deep research related to the politics of energy infrastructure and energy diplomacy. Itay, we were lucky to have as a visiting Israeli faculty member of our institute for multiple years, and he has worked intensively with 2 Institute undergraduate fellow alumni, who I hope will be joining us today, Alex Bar and Nir Maoz, working on transboundary water issues. Miri-Lavi-Neeman is a faculty of the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies of the Ben-Gurion University. The Arava Institute brings together students from Jordan, the Palestinian Authority, Gaza, and Israel. Its faculty is half Palestinian and half Israeli. And prior to working at Arava, she was a doctoral student here at the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley, where she received her PhD. She was then in the Israel Institute, the Berkeley Institute postdoctoral fellow, and she was the research director, the founding research director of the Berkeley Institute. So she's been part of our family since day one. Miri's scholarship currently works on the return of agriculture to the Negev region, on decentralized food production, climate justice, gender, and the sustainability in unrecognized Bedouin villages in and off the grid. We are extremely pleased to have them both here, and I will turn the floor over to the two of you. Welcome, everybody.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and good evening to those in Israel. The reason I'm so excited to be here today, in addition to the honor and to be back at the Institute, at least digitally, with my friend and colleague, Itay Fischendler, is also because this is really, really an exciting project, and I think for several reasons. First, I think when we usually talk about Gaza, we are used to think about Gaza in terms of what it lacks, and not so much in terms of what's there. And here is a research that really speaks about what Gaza has. And as we will learn later on, I think from Itay, many of us that are living under much easier conditions don't have yet, at least. In other words, this is really a study that I think shows quite an impressive achievement of Gaza in the realm of renewables, renewable energy, which really stands in stark opposition to the ways in which Gaza is conceptualized in public imagination and in media. So this is one thing. The other that pertain maybe more to, I think, the research side of this project, is that we also are used to hear about Gaza, about how isolated and inaccessible it is. We at Arava Institute, where I work, try hard to do all sorts of wastewater and energy project and train people, and we really need to fight hard to be in touch with people or to be able to do these things. So I think one question that is of really interest to me is to Itay, which I will later on ask, is really how one does research, particularly social research in Gaza. And third, I think this is there is really a lot of research, definitely, about fossil-based energy. We know that geopolitics and oil politics go together, and usually the circumstances are not that nice. But here we have much less about geopolitics and renewable energy. And so I think this research beyond the case of Gaza also opens up some questions about the relationship between renewable energy and geopolitics. And in addition, we have a place in the Western world that is in really short and dire conditions in terms of electricity and everything else that results, that comes, there is a chain of effect that is due to the lack of electricity in Gaza. I think people probably that are with us here heard many times about this. And here we have really a revolution that regard climate change in a place with such dire condition. And I think there are larger questions here about development of climate change technologies and projects in different parts of the world, in other parts of the world, and maybe we can learn about, and particularly in places that are in conflict. Or under conflict. And here, of course, we're talking about internal conflict in Gaza and the conflict with Israel. So there are many, many things I'd like to hear today, and I'm going to try and satisfy our curiosity at these multiple levels. I'll try at least. So those regarding more particularly Gaza and the case of Gaza, and some more that extend the case of Gaza and push us to think more about renewable geopolitics and climate change, a little bit more globally. So I'm now moving to the real expert here about renewables, which is, and I want to call here Itay, and I really think, Itay, maybe we should really start from the beginning and ask maybe 2-3 very basic questions. The first is why renewable energy is important, and why is it important to perform or to have social research about renewable energy? So what exactly do you study, and why is it important in places like Gaza in particular?
Okay, good morning, everyone. So nice to be in Berkeley again, although it's a bit a virtual visit, but that's what we have for now. And first, I have to reiterate the fact that I still have a love affair with UC Berkeley and with the Israeli Institute. And let's see what the future holds. So it's great to be back again. And let me do share screen. It will be easier because I will be using a few slides on the way. Do you see the shared screen? Great. Okay, so let's start with the basics because most of you are not energy experts. And the basic fact has to do with the notion that we are in the midst of a renewable revolution. It's only a matter of about 20 years or even less that most of the energy that we will produce will be renewable energy, whether it is hydro water, whether it is wind energy or solar energy. Most of the consumption will be renewable energy. And you could see it in this slide. And actually, if you do not believe me, maybe you should listen to your previous president. And in about 2 years ago, he made a statement that you could see, as you could see, that the future is around renewables and it is beneficial. And on top of it, it is beneficial for the Americans. And actually, he was saying to the Trump administration that there is no turning back. We are already within the renewable phase. So you're asking me about why me as a social scientist, I do energy, including renewables. And it's a good question because up to about 5 years, I knew nothing about energy and about renewables. I've been doing transboundary water governance. And then I was looking for a new avenue, for a new adventure, and I had the impression that renewables, it's the future. And then I realized that most of the social scientists, they do not do energy. Energy has been dominated by physicists, engineers, a few economists that are doing modeling and optimizations, but not social scientists. But then I realized that, and again, I was not the first one, but there is a growing trend which has started around 5, 6, 7 years ago. Then I realized that social scientists have a major role in explaining energy phenomena. I can give you an example. Apparently, the safest, cheapest energy source is, take a guess, nuclear energy. Nevertheless, I would say that most of you would resent nuclear energy for a variety of social and behavioral reasons. And the literature has found it very difficult to explain why are we, or most of us, are against nuclear energy. So that's a good excuse for why do we need social scientists. But Miri mentioned another issue. It mentioned the issue of geopolitics and the case of Gaza. So when I joined the bandwagon of energy and social science, I was looking for an angle that have an advantage. That has to do with my weak spot around geopolitics. So I've been trying to develop the field of transboundary energy or energy diplomacy, whatever it means. And I was looking for a case study, a few case studies that may allow me to conceptualize what do I mean by renewable energy and geopolitics. And it took me another 2 years to realize that actually I'm in the best location to explore the connection between geopolitics and renewables. We have the case of Gaza. Of course, it's an extreme case. We have the West Bank. And these two cases I assumed when I started the project a few years ago, can be a great pilot to see the interplay, the potential connection between renewables and geopolitics, if there is one. But by that time, it made sense to me, or I assumed that there should be, because the future is renewables, and there is severe electricity scarcity, both within the West Bank and, of course, in Gaza. Miriam also mentioned the rhetoric about energy, conventional energy, and geopolitics, and we're all familiar with it. You could look at the slide and you would see how the oil embargo has been described, but my real interest is not around conventional energy, but around renewables. And I was looking for a theoretical angle, because usually I do not do case studies. I do theory and then I examine them through a case study. And then again, it took me another year of going through the literature to come up with a very basic hypothesis, two competing hypotheses that I would like to present to you and then test them through the case of Gaza. One hypothesis argues that conflict conditions hinders renewable diffusion. Think of a conflict setting. Think if you are an entrepreneur and you're looking for a way to invest your money, and you need to make sure there is a financial and political stability. Otherwise, you're not likely to get your investment. And these conditions we are not likely to find them in a conflict area. So following this line of thought, we would argue that a conflict condition would hinder renewable diffusion. This is on one end. On the other end, we may find the opposite situation. Think of a country which imports most of its energy resources and is exposed to energy sanctions and to embargoes. Obviously, it would like to be self-sufficient to produce its own electricity, right? And think of the option of it producing its own electricity through renewables, which means that a country may invest and subsidize and incentivize renewables in order to become energy independent. So we have two contrasting options. Either the conflict hinders renewable diffusion or the other way around. The conflict actually incentivizes and encourages renewable diffusion. This is where I started, at least theoretically.
Okay, I think we will go back to some of these questions about geopolitics conflict, because there's also a lot to think here in terms of when the actual confrontation is happening, in what way renewables are better, in what way they help. So there are also this set of questions about conflict and renewable. But before we go into all these questions, I think we are still with the basics just for a second, because I know people probably are relying on different sources about Gaza. And I do want to ask you, so we develop here a common language, what is really the situation of power and electricity in Gaza in terms of renewable? What's out there, what isn't there, and how renewables that are there developed over time? What's the history of this thing?
Okay, it's a great question. And in the last 3 years, together with a previous student of mine, Lios David, and another colleague, Lior Herman from the IR department, we've been trying to figure out the energy landscape of Gaza. And for those who are not familiar with Gaza, let me just say a few words about the history of Gaza. Gaza was under the British mandate, and in 1948, it has been taken up by Egypt, and in 1967, it has been taken up by the Israelis. And in 2004, there was the Israeli disengagement plan, the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, and it was taken by the Palestinian Authority. And 2 years later, in 2006, it was taken by the Hamas. So this is, in a nutshell, the political history of Gaza. But now let's go again back to the electricity landscape. Gaza receives electricity from three main sources. The major one is Israeli electricity through about a dozen of electricity cables. There is electricity that used to be coming from Egypt in the south, and on top of it, they have their own power plant, which they also use for producing electricity. The issue is that there is a limited capacity. The system is old and quite often malfunction. And if this is not enough, we have to take into account the fact that Israel has been using electricity to some extent as a punitive measure against the Palestinians. Usually it is in the form of energy embargoes, limiting the amount of electricity that Israel delivers to the Palestinians, but at least in one very extreme case, Israel bombarded, targeted the power plant in Gaza. It was an exceptional case, a terrible mistake that Israel did, admitted that it would not happen again. I can talk about it later on, why it was a terrible mistake. As to the energy landscape, so me and Lioz, the student, we have been trying to figure out what's the extent of electricity availability in Gaza. And if you look at this figure, it shows you the supply of electricity to Gaza Strip by the number of hours per day. And if you look closely, you will see that from a situation a decade ago, when there was 24/7 electricity, nowadays there is, on average, about 4 hours of electricity a day. Nowadays, the situation is slightly better. There is about 8 hours a day of electricity. But can you imagine a life with only 5 or 6 or 7 hours of electricity a day? I can't imagine a life even without, I don't know. Of course, we expect 24/7 electricity a day. So as to the renewable revolution, so we've been trying to figure out, and in a way, it has all started by sort of a personal story. I remember 3 years ago, there was a student knocking on my door after I started my energy seminar, and he said that he's a technology guy, and he is a remote sensing guy, and he thinks that he is able, through remote sensing, to detect solar panels on rooftops. And he is deeply interested in Gaza. So this is how it is all started, by a tiny exercise initiated by a very creative student. So you could see a few pictures on rooftops in Gaza. On your left, you could see the Shifa Hospital, one of the major hospitals in Gaza, and you could see the solar panels on its rooftops. So me and the students for the last 3 years have been trying to identify the extent of the revolution. Here in this figure, you could see the Strip of Gaza. You could see the major urban center of Gaza, and you could see the surroundings of Gaza, which are mostly refugee camps. You could see Khan Yunis and Rafah, two other urban centers in the south next to the border of Egypt. And in yellow, in the yellow circles, you could see what we mapped in 2012 by using remote sensing. And you could see about half a dozen of solar sites. And by solar site, I mean at least the size of 2 square meters. And, and if you look at the situation 2 years afterwards, in 2014, you could see about 30, 40 solar sites, mostly around the urban center of Gaza. And if you look at the situation a year after, in 2015, you could see about 100 sites. And if you look at the situation 3 years after, you could see that there are 3,000 sites. And of course, a site could be larger than 2 square meters. scattered all over the Gaza Strip. And if you look at the situation today, you could see that they have about at least 10,000 sites covering the majority of Gaza Strip. But if you were an energy expert, you would probably ask me, so how much really they produce from renewables? So that's what we were trying to figure out. And in this figure, you could see the different energy resources that are feeding Gaza: the Israeli electricity, the Egyptian, the Gaza power plant, and the PV. And you could see that, roughly speaking, today, about 18% of electricity in Gaza is renewables. Can you imagine the figure of 18% of renewables in Gaza, while in Israel we have only about 8%, while in California we have about 25%. But of course, can you compare California with Gaza? I doubt it. Can you compare Israel in terms of economic capacities with Gaza? I doubt it. Nevertheless, Gaza has twice as much electricity, renewable electricity, than Israel.
Okay, I do want to just give a minute, maybe very shortly, on the way you actually access data and information in Gaza, because this is interesting, not just because it's interesting to know how did you conduct this research, but also I think it tells us something about the materiality of different natural resources. I think it's oil is underground politics, and solar energy and panels are on rooftops, and I think it enables also a different method, and I think it's not just accidental that all underground energy is so secretive and it's so hidden from eyes. But renewable here is interesting because it's out there and on rooftops. And I do want to ask you, how do you gather information, particularly social? You do social science in a place you don't have an access to.
You're right, and this was and it is still a major barrier. And as I mentioned, we have been using remote sensing. I know nothing about technology. Everything that I touch, I actually break. So I was lucky to have the student available, Lios David, and the student has been using remote sensing. And remote sensing is something which is available in the market. If you have a credit card or a subscription, you could buy remote sensing layers. And that's actually what we did. We acquired remote sensing layers from 2012, 14, 15, 18, and 19. And you could see here a remote sensing image, one of thousands that we used. And if you look carefully, you could see that on rooftops of buildings, you could actually identify solar panels. But we decided to cover the entire Gaza Strip, which is quite huge, which means that you cannot do it manually. Of course you can, but it will take you years. So the technical challenge was, again, for the students, not for me, was to computerize it, and to do it through machine learning, through a computerized process that can identify the solar panels and make sure that what he identifies is indeed a solar panel. But Miri, as you mentioned, it is a remote sensing, and we were deeply interested in the social processes, and usually remote sensing does not tell you that.
Okay, so I do want to, so Itay, just to understand, so there weren't any interviews involved, working with NGOs to learn, not at all? This is just technology?
Not exactly. I mean, at the beginning, to identify the extent of the revolution, we could do it through remote sensing. But remote sensing does not tell us anything about the causality, about what triggers it. So we made contact with, our goal was to go beyond remote sensing. What we really wanted to do is to run a survey in Gaza that would go from one house to the other, would knock on doors and would ask people, why did you move to renewables? What were the alternatives? How expensive it is? Are you happy with that? And all of that. So we approached a few NGOs, and we also approached the donor community. And actually, we were able to meet with them and with a few local academics from Gaza. We were able to meet them abroad. And they were very curious about our project. And most of them were quite eager to join in. But obviously, we had to raise some funding. And the Arava Institute was, again, generous enough to give us some seed money in order to use for the survey. So the money was available. There were potential NGOs who were willing to deliver the money, because it was obvious for us that as an Israeli from the Hebrew University, we cannot cooperate. It's not that we are not allowed. Of course I'm allowed, but I'm unable to deliver funds to Gaza. And on top of it, I was quite sure that they would hesitate receiving money from the Hebrew University, especially under the Hamas regime. And we were quite optimistic about the process, but eventually, because any survey has to go through the Ministry of Interior, which is ruled by the Hamas, at the end of the day, all of them said no, they are unable to do it. But many developers were willing to talk with us, to have a fun conversation with us, even to meet us in person. And we met them and we got some insights about the process. But again, it cannot be a replacement for a deep survey.
Okay, so I do want to ask you a little bit about what you did learn through with these limitations and under these limits, I think, because we are still talking about 18% is quite a revolution, particularly if we think about Israel. And Gaza is situated in such a complicated politics, both in terms of its relationship with the Palestinian Authority and with Israel. So, and we know that those things require all sorts of, to have renewable energy on my building. What does it entail? What is it? What do I need to do? What does it take to achieve 80% renewable in a place like this? Is it a matter of collective organization, of social organization? Do people do it collaboratively? Is there any other, are there any other influences like different land uses that encourage renewables? In other words, tell us a little bit on what enabled this revolution beyond just the severe, shortage.
It's a good question. I will give you a flavor of it, because I have a feeling that we are running out of time. So as you mentioned, there is a renewable revolution, and we were deeply interested in the social processes. But we had to settle with remote sensing in most cases. So I can give you an example on how you can use remote sensing, at least to identify the effect of land use on renewable energy. So in this figure, you could see 4 different land uses, whether you are a refugee camp, an agricultural land use, an urban one, and a suburban one. And you could see, and what we measured is actually the density of renewable sites per area, a long time. And you could see that if it is an urban land use, you're more likely to adopt renewable panels. That's where the revolution has started, followed by the land use of a refugee camp, followed by the land use of suburban land use, and finally at the end, if it's around agricultural land use, which we could see does not encourage the renewable revolution. But you were asking a different question. you were asking about collective action. The landscape in Gaza is totally different than the landscape in Berkeley. In Berkeley, you live, you own a flat, you own a building, you own the rooftop, right? And if you would like to install a system on your rooftop, the only person you need to ask is your partner. This is not the case in Gaza. In Gaza, most people, they share houses. There are a few tenants, at least a few, that share a building. And we were trying to figure out how many tenants it takes to get a solar system on your rooftop. Of course, if it was a survey, if we had a survey available, it would have been very easy. You knock on the door and you ask him, how many are you? How much money each one of you chipped in? But we couldn't do that. So we were looking for a creative indicator, a very primitive one, which is the height of the building, which you could identify through remote sensing, because unfortunately, this was available. And in this figure, you could see the distribution of PV sites as a function of the height of the buildings for the year 2018. And you could see by large that about 90% of the sites, of the solar sites, are built on houses that are between, I would say, 6, 7 to 8 meters, up to about 15 meters high. Which means that all of the sites, the majority of them, are built on houses that are between 3 stories buildings to up to 5 stories buildings. And I guess the next question is why? And I think I can speculate that if you have too many tenants, then it's difficult to reach an agreement. On top of it, your portion of energy is rather small. But if you have not enough tenants, less tenants, then the system becomes way too expensive because you do not have neighbors to share the cost with them. So you end up with a sort of an optimal number of tenants, somewhere between, I would say, 6, 7 to 15, that would increase the likelihood for having an energy system on your rooftop.
And Itay, what about other relations that are formed and emerged out of this? I mean, you need finances, you need batteries. We think of Gaza as one of those isolated places. I mean, often we think about renewables in context of island states and why is it helpful there? But is anything in this? I mean, is the fact that there are renewables in Gaza now form new geography, new economic relationship? How do battery get there? Where do they get the solar panels from? Is Israel involved in this? Does it care? I mean, do we care in Israel about what's going on there in terms of renewables? How involved we are? What do we know about these things?
Yeah, it's a bit of the $1 million question, because these things cannot be detected through remote sensing. And at some stage, we realized we need to talk to the developers. And we realized that there is sort of a chain of production. The solar panels are being bought by Israeli developers. They export them from China. They then sell them to developers on the West Bank, Palestinian developers, that later on sell them to developers in Gaza Strip, who sells them to the communities. So, and of course, as you could imagine, each takes his own cut. You have about 2 or 3 brokers in between. As to the question about batteries, this is an interesting question because you could use the solar panels during the daytime, but during the night there is no sun, which means that you need to store the energy through batteries. And the question is, how do they get them? And again, it's a similar question. It's a similar story. Again, they are being imported and goes all the way to the West Bank and then to Gaza Strip. But then we realized we had a few conversations with the Israeli establishment and the Israeli security, and we realized that the Israelis are highly involved. And the Israelis allows the exportation of solar panels to the Gaza Strip, and they allows the exportation of basic batteries, acid batteries, because they do not perceive them as a security threat. But whenever it comes to more advanced batteries that could have what Israelis call a dual use, also a security and a civilian use, these batteries are prohibited from getting into the Gaza Strip.
Okay, so I can see also how under conditions of to decrease dependency and under condition of confrontation, a system of renewables is more helpful than a centralized a grid, or that may be also target for attacks and things that we know from the past. I want to ask you from more the big environmental question here. Is this sustainable? Do you see renewables in Gaza as, I mean, I know the word sustainable is problematic in so many ways. It's a trope. We say sustainable on many, many things, but with all the problematics that comes with it, in what sense renewables in Gaza are sustainable given its economic situation and political situation?
I wish I could give you a clear-cut answer about the sustainability of the entire adventure. But let's start by unpacking what do you mean by sustainability. If sustainability means getting greener, emitting less green gas, definitely the renewable revolution is sustainable. Once they move from coal or oil or diesel to renewables, they emit less pollutants. So on the environmental side, it seems like it is sustainable. But sustainability has another dimension, which is the equity and fairness dimension. And now think about renewables. It's expensive, especially for how much money they make for their income, which means that those who buy it are those who can afford it. And those who do not have it, they stay with nothing, which means that we could argue that the transition towards renewables is likely to increase the inequality within Gaza. If you are fortunate, you have it 24/7, and if you are not, then you are stuck almost with no running electricity. So from the equity dimension, it's definitely not sustainable unless the donor community would offset such an effect and maybe subsidize systems for poor communities.
Okay, so there's much more than I want to ask you, but we're running out of time. I just want to kind of just raise at least the questions, and then we kind of, maybe we can entice the other people to ask them instead of me. I'm kind of cheating here, but I do want to ask, what's the secret? Why are we failing in Israel and in Gaza? There is such a revolution. We have to ask this question, and there is question here definitely about expertise and who runs this. Are these engineers? Is it the part of the fact that this is completely uninstitutionalized? Is that good for Gaza? Should it be institutionalized? Is that helpful under a conflict? Is there any chance that this is going to spark other changes to encourage cooperation of some sorts? So I'm going to leave all these questions unanswered unless there are no questions, and then maybe you can answer them. And maybe I'm going to let I'm going to let people ask questions because I probably have some for you.
I want to say thank you both so much for in the middle of the night taking the time to rejoin us here in Berkeley, your Berkeley family, and share with us your interesting new research, which, as we've heard, is not even out yet. We look forward to seeing the effects that it has and the outlets that you find for it, Thank you both for such an interesting conversation. I'll just take a moment and say that our next summer salon will be on July 8th at 10 a.m., where Professor Sharon Aronson-Lahavi, the head of the theater department at Tel Aviv and a former professor of visiting Israeli professor here at Berkeley in theater, is going to speak on using Israeli theater, contemporary Israeli theater, to look at what can theater teach us in times of crisis and transformation.